We are witnessing something extraordinary unfold in the Caribbean, something that would have seemed impossible just a decade ago. Russian warships are positioned off the coast of Venezuela, not as a temporary visit, but as a statement of geopolitical realignment that challenges 2 centuries of hemispheric dominance. To understand the significance of this moment, we need to look beyond the military hardware and examine the economic forces that have brought us here. Let me start with a fundamental question. How does a nation with the world's largest proven oil reserves, roughly 303 billion barrels, find itself at the center of a confrontation between global superpowers? The answer lies in understanding Venezuela not as an isolated case of political dysfunction, but as a critical node in the transformation of the global economic order. Venezuela's oil reserves represent approximately 1/5 of all proven reserves globally. This is not some marginal player in energy markets. This is a country sitting on more oil than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than anyone else. Yet today, Venezuela produces only about 1 million barrels per day. At its peak in the 1990s, Venezuela was producing over 3 million barrels daily. The gap between potential and reality is staggering, and it is precisely this gap that creates the geopolitical opportunity we are witnessing. The economic warfare waged against Venezuela has been systematic and devastating. According to United Nations Special Rapporteur Elena Duhan, American sanctions caused Venezuelan government revenue to shrink by 99%. This is not economic pressure. This is economic annihilation. When you reduce a government's revenue by that magnitude, you are not trying to change policy. You are trying to collapse the state entirely. The sanctions regime has operated on multiple levels. Direct sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company blocked the country's access to international financial systems. Secondary sanctions threaten any company or country doing business with Venezuela. The most symbolic was Citgo, Venezuela's crown jewel in the United States. A Delaware judge recently ordered its sale for $5.9 billion to settle debts, effectively confiscating a strategic national asset. But here is where economics intersects with geopolitics in fascinating ways. Sanctions only work if the target has no alternatives. The entire premise of American economic coercion rests on dollar dominance and the centrality of Western financial systems. What we are seeing now is the emergence of alternative systems that bypass these choke points entirely. The strategic partnership treaty signed between Russia and Venezuela in May 2025 is not just a military agreement. It is an economic restructuring that spans energy, finance, infrastructure, security, and military cooperation for the next decade. Russia ratified this treaty in October, placing Venezuela in a very exclusive group alongside Belarus, China, Iran, and North Korea. These are countries that have been forced or chosen to operate outside Western economic architecture. Look at the trade numbers. Russian-Venezuelan trade increased by 64% in 2024. We are talking about approximately 350 bilateral agreements covering everything from military cooperation to aerospace technology to nuclear energy development. Venezuela is building parallel systems, alternative supply chains, different financial channels. The energy dimension deserves special attention. Russia has expertise in heavy crude production, exactly the type of oil Venezuela has in abundance. Russian companies bring technology, capital, and most importantly, a willingness to operate outside Western financial systems. When Chevron's operating licenses in Venezuela expired under the Trump administration, it created a vacuum. Russian companies are positioned to fill that vacuum.
Now let us talk about the 25% tariffs the Trump administration imposed on countries importing Venezuelan oil, effective April 2nd, 2025. Who does this actually hurt?
It certainly damages Venezuela, but it also creates severe problems for refineries in the United States Gulf Coast that were specifically designed to process Venezuelan heavy crude. You cannot simply switch feedstocks without massive capital investment. More strategically, these tariffs accelerate Venezuela's pivot away from American markets. If you cannot sell to the United States, you sell elsewhere. China remains the world's largest oil importer. India has shown willingness to buy sanctioned oil at discounts. Both countries are developing payment systems that do not rely on dollars. What the tariffs accomplish is cementing Venezuela's integration into non-Western economic blocs. The deployment of Russian air defense systems to Venezuela, specifically Panzer S-1 and Buk M2E systems, should be understood in economic terms as much as military ones. These systems protect infrastructure. In a country whose entire economy depends on oil production, protecting refineries, ports, and production facilities is protecting economic capacity. The presence of Russian warships extends this protective umbrella offshore. Let me address the Monroe Doctrine, because it provides essential historical context. When President James Monroe announced on December 2nd, 1823, that the United States would oppose European intervention in the Western Hemisphere, it was economic sphere of influence, construction. The doctrine essentially declared Latin America as an American economic zone. For 200 years, this framework held because of American economic and military dominance. What is happening now represents the unwinding of that dominance when Russian warships operate freely in the Caribbean, when China becomes the primary trading partner for multiple Latin American countries, when Venezuela signs comprehensive strategic partnerships with Russia. The Monroe Doctrine becomes historically interesting but operationally irrelevant. The current American military deployment is significant. More than a dozen warships and approximately 15,000 troops in the Caribbean region, including the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, ostensibly for counter-narcotics operations. But declaring Venezuelan airspace closed, as President Trump did on November 29, 2025, is not counter-narcotics policy. It is the language of blockade. Here is the economic calculation facing Washington. Military intervention in Venezuela would be catastrophically expensive. Venezuela is not Iraq or Libya. It has significant military capabilities, rough terrain, and now explicitly Russian support. The economic cost of occupation would be measured in trillions over years. And for what? To secure oil fields that would take years to restore to full production. Moreover, military action would likely destroy the very infrastructure you are trying to secure. Oil facilities are fragile. Refineries are complex. This is why, despite the military posturing, the more likely scenario remains economic siege warfare, attempting to deny Venezuela access to resources until internal collapse occurs. But this is where the Russian and Chinese involvement fundamentally alters the calculation. Economic siege only works if you can enforce isolation. Russia and China provide economic lifelines that bypass American sanctions. Trade in non-dollar currencies, particularly Chinese yuan and Russian rubles, removes the dollar as a weapon. Russian technical expertise keeps oil production functioning. The broader picture involves the BRICS bloc: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now expanding to include additional members. These countries represent roughly 40% of global population and an increasing share of global GDP. They are actively developing alternative payment systems, reserve currencies, and trade frameworks that do not depend on Western financial infrastructure. Venezuela becomes symbolically important as a test case for whether countries can successfully operate outside the Western system. Let us examine the humanitarian dimension through an economic lens. Venezuela has experienced a humanitarian catastrophe. Millions have fled the country. The economy contracted by roughly three-quarters from its peak. There are competing narratives about responsibility. The Venezuelan government points to sanctions as the primary cause. The United States blames government mismanagement and corruption. The economic reality is that both factors interact. Sanctions exacerbated existing problems and make solutions virtually impossible. When you cannot access international banking, you cannot import medicine. When you cannot sell oil freely, you cannot generate government revenue for social programs. The Trump administration's decision to revoke temporary protected status for approximately 600,000 Venezuelans in the United States adds another layer. These are people who fled precisely the conditions that sanctions help create. The economic impact is significant both for the individuals and for Venezuela, which has lost millions of educated, working-age citizens. The disputed election of July 28th, 2024 adds political complexity. Electoral authorities declared President Nicolas Maduro the winner with 51% to 44%, but the opposition claimed their candidate won decisively, and international observers stated the election could not be considered democratic. The lack of transparent vote counting created a legitimacy crisis. This political uncertainty directly impacts economic decision-making. International companies will not invest in countries where property rights are uncertain and political transitions are disputed. Banks will not lend. Insurance becomes prohibitively expensive. The political crisis and economic crisis reinforce each other in a destructive cycle. Now, let me address the strategic calculations of the major powers involved. Russia gains multiple advantages from its Venezuelan partnership. First, it establishes military presence in the Western Hemisphere, directly challenging American regional dominance. This provides leverage in other negotiations, particularly regarding Ukraine. Second, it creates economic opportunities in energy and defense sectors. Third, it demonstrates to other countries that alternatives to Western alignment exist and can be sustained even under pressure. China's calculus is more complex. China has lent Venezuela tens of billions of dollars over the years, much of it secured by future oil deliveries. These loans are now problematic because Venezuela cannot produce enough oil to repay them. China is cautious about escalating confrontation with the United States over Venezuela. Chinese companies operate in Venezuela, but at reduced levels compared to a decade ago. Iran represents another dimension of this multipolar alignment. Iran has provided missiles, drones, and equipment to Venezuela. For Iran, Venezuela offers a way to project influence and demonstrate that American pressure can be resisted. The two countries share experience with sanctions and economic isolation. The United States faces a strategic dilemma. Every escalation strengthens the narrative that America is an imperial power unwilling to accept multipolar reality. Military intervention would be economically ruinous and diplomatically catastrophic. But backing down signals declining power. The current approach, maximum pressure short of war, has not achieved regime change despite years of implementation. Let me discuss the implications for global energy markets. The world needs approximately 100 million barrels per day. Losing Venezuela's production capacity tightens global supply. This pushes prices higher, which ironically benefits Russia, Iran, and other sanctioned producers. Higher oil prices also generate inflation globally. If Venezuela could restore production to historical levels with Russian and Chinese assistance, it would add millions of barrels per day to global supply. This would pressure prices downward, potentially undermining American shale producers who need higher prices to remain profitable. Venezuelan oil returning to markets under Russian and Chinese influence shifts the balance of power in global price setting. The infrastructure dimension cannot be ignored. Venezuela's oil industry has deteriorated dramatically due to lack of investment, brain drain, and sanctions preventing access to technology. Restoring production would require tens of billions of dollars and years of sustained effort. Russia and China could provide this, but they would expect strategic returns, likely including long-term supply contracts and equity stakes. This would effectively transfer Venezuelan energy sovereignty from potential American influence to Russian and Chinese influence. The financial system aspect deserves deeper examination. The American dollar's dominance in international trade rests on network effects. Everyone uses dollars because everyone uses dollars. This creates dependency on American financial infrastructure. Sanctions work because being cut off from dollar systems means being cut off from global trade.
But network effects can unwind if alternatives reach critical mass. China's cross-border interbank payment system processes transactions in yuan without touching American financial infrastructure.
Russia's system for transfer of financial messages provides an alternative to SWIFT. These systems are currently smaller and less efficient than Western systems, but they function and they are growing. Venezuela's integration into these alternative systems is economically significant beyond Venezuela's size. It demonstrates that countries can sustain basic trade and financial operations outside Western infrastructure. Every successful example encourages other countries to develop contingency plans, reducing American financial leverage globally. The long-term implication is a fragmented global financial system with competing blocks. Let us talk about debt and reconstruction. Venezuela owes enormous sums to various creditors. These debts are largely unpayable at current economic levels. Any future Venezuelan government will need to restructure this debt. The terms of restructuring will depend on Venezuela's bargaining power, which depends on its economic alternatives. If Venezuela is economically dependent on Western markets and finance, it will accept harsh restructuring terms. If Venezuela has genuine alternatives through Russian and Chinese support, it can demand better terms or simply default and rebuild through alternative partnerships. The presence of Russian warships signals that Venezuela has options, which changes the economic calculations of creditors. The human capital dimension is crucial for any economic recovery. Venezuela has lost millions of citizens, including many of its most educated and skilled workers. This brain drain represents a massive loss of productive capacity that cannot be quickly replaced. Reconstruction would require either convincing diaspora to return, which requires political and economic stability, or importing expertise from Russian and Chinese technical advisors. Now, what are the possible economic scenarios going forward? The first scenario is successful American pressure leading to regime change. A new Venezuelan government oriented toward Washington would receive sanctions relief and access to international finance. Oil production could gradually recover with Western investment. The economic challenges are substantial. Any new government inherits a destroyed economy, unpayable debts, and degraded infrastructure. Recovery would take years and require massive capital inflows. The second scenario is a negotiated settlement where sanctions are partially lifted in exchange for political reforms. Venezuela maintains relations with Russia and China but reduces military cooperation. This is theoretically optimal but requires both sides to compromise. The third scenario is prolonged stalemate. Sanctions remain, Venezuela survives through Russian and Chinese support, and the current low-level conflict continues indefinitely. This is economically damaging for everyone involved. Unfortunately, this may be the most likely scenario. The fourth scenario is military escalation. Direct American intervention draws in Russian military support. This would be economically catastrophic, triggering broader great power confrontation. Oil prices would spike, global trade would contract. This scenario remains unlikely but cannot be entirely dismissed. The fifth scenario is successful Venezuelan consolidation with Russian and Chinese backing. Venezuela stabilizes politically and restores oil production through alternative partnerships. This would represent a significant geopolitical defeat for the United States and would encourage other countries to pursue similar paths. Let me discuss the implications for the broader international economic order. The Bretton Woods system, established after World War II, created institutions dominated by Western powers. For decades, this system appeared inevitable and universal. What we are observing now is the emergence of parallel institutions. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank challenges the World Bank. The BRICS New Development Bank provides alternative financing. Regional trade agreements bypass WTO frameworks. These developments are directly related to countries seeking alternatives after observing Venezuela, Iran, and Russia being weaponized out of Western systems. The economic efficiency loss from pragmatic systems is real, but efficiency arguments assume benign governance. When financial infrastructure becomes a weapon, countries rationally invest in alternatives despite efficiency losses. Venezuela's experience teaches other countries that integration into Western systems creates vulnerability. For developing countries observing the Venezuela situation, the lessons are complex. Venezuela's economic collapse warns against policies that alienate major powers. But Venezuela's survival, despite maximum American pressure, demonstrates that alternatives exist if you can find alternative partners. I want to address the question of whether Russian and Chinese support for Venezuela is economically rational for Russia and China themselves. For Russia, the costs are modest, while the benefits include strategic positioning and energy sector opportunities. For China, the calculation is more ambiguous. China has lent billions to Venezuela with questionable repayment prospects. However, China thinks in long time horizons and values strategic positioning. Let me conclude by synthesizing these threads. Venezuela sits on 1/5 of the world's oil reserves at a moment when the global order is fragmenting. American attempts to control Venezuelan resources through sanctions have not succeeded in achieving regime change, but have succeeded in destroying the Venezuelan economy. This failure creates an opening for rival powers to offer alternatives. Russian warships in the Caribbean symbolize something larger than military deployment. They represent the economic and political emergence of a multipolar world where American preferences no longer automatically prevail. The Monroe Doctrine is ending because the economic and military realities that sustained it no longer exist. The global economy is fragmenting into competing blocs with different rules, currencies, and institutions. This fragmentation is economically inefficient and reduces global welfare overall, but it redistributes power away from the American-dominated order toward a more contested multipolar arrangement. Venezuela is simultaneously a cause and consequence of this transformation. The economic stakes are enormous. access to Venezuelan oil affects global energy markets. The demonstration effect of whether countries can successfully operate outside Western systems affects the future architecture of international economics. The question of whether sanctions can compel political change affects the range of tools available to major powers, and the humanitarian consequences affect millions of human lives. What we are witnessing is not simply a crisis in Venezuela. It is the painful, dangerous, and potentially violent transition from one international economic order to another. The previous order, dominated by American power and Western institutions, is weakening but not yet gone. The emerging order, more fragmented and multipolar, is not yet established. Venezuela finds itself at the intersection of these historical forces. The next months and years will reveal whether this transition proceeds through negotiation or through conflict. The economic cost of conflict would be catastrophic, but history suggests that dominant powers rarely yield position gracefully, and rising powers rarely accept subordinate roles indefinitely. Venezuela may appear to be about one country's domestic politics, but economically and strategically, it is about the fundamental question of power in the 21st century global order. Thank you.